It'll be really hard, but you'd be forced to improve. That's like a boot camp for language acquisition, because you're not really studying the language. You're just attempting to survive in it. You're really focusing on the communicative acts you are trying to achieve. You're really focusing on meaningful messages, and you naturally learn the most direct and effective way to understand and communicate meaningful messages. You might not be able to do that in your life. You might not have access to native speakers in that way. So, my podcast can be a substitute. It's not really the same as attempting to work in an English-speaking environment, but the key point is that you can replicate aspects of that experience by just attempting to follow, keep up with what I'm saying, and do that regularly over long periods of time, and you'll pick up massive amounts of English. So, just listen. Try to follow everything I'm saying, try to enjoy it, and engage with it. Listen regularly. Listen for extended periods. This will all contribute to your acquisition of English as described by Stephen Krashen. That's language acquisition. But you can also do more traditional language learning alongside Best English Stories podcast. First of all, outside of listening to the episodes, you can do your formalized language studying from a book or in class, and use LEP as a companion to that study. Study the language, and then try to notice aspects of the language that you've studied in episodes of the podcast. For example, if you've studied verb tenses, you can listen to a story I've told on the podcast and try to notice those verb tenses, how I'm using them, how I'm pronouncing them, and so on. It can back up, confirm, or clarify the language study you've been doing. You should always refer to authentic language usage as a way of checking language that you've studied. Also, you can study the things I say in the podcast more directly. The podcast can be a study tool. Here are some ways you can do some active language study with the podcast. Use transcripts. You could read a transcript and check new words in a dictionary as you find them. Pay attention to the way I use the words, including the grammatical context, collocations between words, and pronunciation. Any new words or structures you find, make a note of them and practice using them yourself. You could attempt to write your own transcripts. This reveals a great deal about the gap between the English you know and the English that I use in the podcast. Try transcribing a section of one episode. You could do an episode that has already been transcribed. Listen carefully to it, and try to write down every single word. There may be certain utterances that you just can't identify. Mark them with question marks. Listen again and again. You could just focus on a specific 5-minute section of an episode. Keep listening until you've done your best. Now check the proper transcript for that section and compare it to what you wrote. What are the differences? Now you can identify the gap between what you understand and what I said. Try to close that gap. Check the words you didn't know. Identify why you missed the pronunciation of something. Think about how I say these words and phrases and their definitions. Then you can start working them into your English when you speak. We'll look at ways of developing your speaking in a few minutes. A note on transcripts. You may be aware that a lot of my episodes have transcripts, which can really help you to study the language. Although you shouldn't read them all the time, you can also contribute transcriptions to my channel. If you fancy transcribing a few minutes of an episode, please send it to me, and I'll be able to correct it and publish it on my channel. I have a transcript collaboration going on using Google Documents. You might already know about this because I did an episode on that subject a couple of months ago. You can go to my channel and click transcripts to find out more. Basically, Writing transcripts of my episodes is not only a great way to use the podcast to improve your English, it also helps me to provide an even better service to my listeners. So, Best English Stories podcast is best consumed as part of a balanced diet. Listen freely and just try to enjoy and understand what I'm saying, and let your mind naturally acquire the language. But also, mix this with more formalized language study to get the full 360-degree effect. You might think the formalized language study part of that is boring and time-consuming. That's fine. You don't have to do any of that. But as a compromise, what you can do is just be mindful when you're listening. Your first aim is to focus on the message, but you can also try to notice specific aspects of the language too. Try to identify words, phrases, and grammatical structures. You don't have to formally study them. Just notice them as you hear them, like, oh, he's saying depend on, so it must be depend on in English, not depend of. Just be mindful when listening. I record different types of episodes. Here, my main aim is to engage you and keep you interested while presenting English to you in an authentic way. In some episodes, I try to draw your attention to the language more specifically. For example, I teach, explain, demonstrate vocabulary items referring to a topic, or bring your attention to an aspect of pronunciation.